Excellent. So, good afternoon and welcome to this e-memoir session, improving the range and quality of your work experience and industry placement offer to meet the needs of learners and employers. This afternoon we're joined by Bij Kaczmarczyk and Jess Widdowson, and I'll allow Bij to do some of the introductions in just a moment. We're expecting the session to last for around about an hour, and as ever we like to keep these webinars as interactive as possible, so feel free to use a question or chat facility at any time. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Bij and to Jess. Thanks all, keep the questions coming.
Thanks very much, Marek, and good afternoon to everyone. I hope you're all keeping well. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Bij Kaczmarczyk. I'm director of 2 training companies and also chair of a medium-sized FE college, and with extensive, I think it's extensive, it must be, it's over 40 years now, experience in the FE and skills sector. I'm joined this afternoon by Jess Widdowson. Jess, do you want to just introduce yourself?
Absolutely. I'm Jess Widdowson and I'm the enterprise team leader at Barnsley College. So myself and my department, part of our role is overseeing the college's employer engagement programme and also recruiting for industry placements as part of the new T-level programme.
That's great. Thanks very much. Now, Jess and I will take you through a series of slides, which, as Marek says, will be available to you at the end of the webinar today, as well as the recording. I just want to set the scene a little bit because I know many of you might be interested in increasing the number of placements you're going to offer, not only for T levels and study programs, but very, very specifically for the traineeship procurement, which, as you know, is just now in process. So hopefully, if you've got any questions that you want to ask specifically about traineeships and the importance of placements, and then please put those to us. If we can't do it during the course of the webinar, we'll certainly do it after. Thanks for that then. Okay, I think my start point is just to say as well, if you look at the FE and skills sector in England, right across the piece, work experience industry placements are key components in a whole range of programs. Now, we're not going to talk a lot today about apprenticeships, but we will specifically raise some of the issues around traineeships and finding good quality placements for those, as well as for supported internships, which I know Jess is also involved in her college, as well as picking up some of the issues for 16 to 19-year-olds in terms of finding appropriate work experience and work placements, either as part of a study program and of course now for the newly introduced T levels. And again, Jess will come in on that. But to not ignore the role of placements across a whole range of vocational programs. Those of you listening in who are working in hairdressing, beauty, catering, hospitality, health and social care, early years, you're very familiar with how important the industry placement is as a key component of achieving that particular qualification, as well as those of you who are providing higher education programs in which the industry placement can be, for example, on a sandwich program, a full year. But we've also got to recognize how important placements are, even if very often they're much shorter, but of course they will be extended now for the Kickstart program, the Kickstart scheme for the unemployed. And I know some of you listening in are already running things like sector-based work academies, so that you're already experienced with working with Job Centre Plus. There's a whole range of different sort of, if you want, modes and examples, but also I think it's important to pick up, and I know we had some questions ahead of today's webinar, which I shared with Jess yesterday about, well, it's okay talking about work experience and industry placements, but how are they funded? One important point to note is that within study programs, they are part of your planned hours, and they will contribute to whether that student is going to be a full-timer or a part-timer. And also inside that, obviously, within a study program is a shorter type of study program known as a traineeship, which we'll refer to a little bit later on. But also to note that in terms of getting ready for T levels, there has been some investment through the Capacity and Delivery Fund for those of you to offer a much wider range and longer, of course, placements at a setup and running cost of £250 per placement. Obviously, that changes each year as more and more of you offer a higher proportion of your study program students these longer placements. We'll talk a wee bit about T levels, and there, of course, the industry placement is funded separately to the T-level funding band, a bit like English and Maths, at £275 per learner per year. How you organise that we'll discuss, and Jess will come in on that specifically. But for those of you who are offering programs for 19-year-olds and over, you know that in some cases the industry placement is funded as part of the qualification rate. There's no separate fund for an industry placement, for example, in the early years diploma, or if you're offering an industry placement as part of, say, for example, a level 3 diploma in beauticians. However, for 19 to 24-year-old learners, there is a separate allocation of funding for the work placement. It's incorporated into what we call the work prep and work placement fund amount, and that's separate from what you get for English and Maths or any flexible programs that you're offering. One thing to note, of course, is quite a lot of our learners are funding the post-19 programs through advanced learner loans, and there again the advanced learner loan pays for the work placement or industry placement if it's an essential part of the qualification. One point therefore to know, outside of traineeships, there is no separate funding for a work placement or industry placement through the AB. We'll pick up traineeships, and obviously the funding, additional funding, the £111 million that's been allocated to young people and to adults, and it's the adult procurement that you're going through as well, and that obviously includes funding for the work placement, which is now being increased from just over £900 to £1,500, but also that there's an incentive payment to an employer to take on up to 10 trainees at £1,000 each, and that is quite important in terms of establishing the administration that's tied to industry placements, as well as other things like PPE and other aspects of training. And then the last sort of group, if we're sort of picking out there, is obviously programs for the unemployed, where we already know that work placement is funded for sector-based work academies, and that also extends to include travel and childcare costs. That's not funded through the AB, that's funded through Job Centre Plus. And then, of course, the important new Kickstart scheme, which I know some of you have already got into some kind of partnership with employers. I did notice that one of you was offering, along with an employer, a Kickstart open day to sort of explain the different types of placements that would be available in that employer. And that's obviously funded, means that the universal credit claimant who is at risk of unemployment in that age group will have the minimum wage, including any national insurance and pension costs covered. And then there's also an additional £1,500 per learner to set up the cost, for the setup cost for the Kickstart scheme. So there's a whole range of funding sources for those different, if you want, uses. I think it's important at this point, and Jess might want to come in at this point, to distinguish a little bit between, I think, traditionally what people in schools and colleges recognize as the work experience program, which is often a short duration program, maybe 1 or 2 weeks, which has to give the learner a taste of the working environment outside of the normal place of learning. And that's why it was preferably with an external employer. There've been variations on that. Sometimes it's a 1 week, 2 week block. Sometimes it's a day a week. But I think the most important thing is that that is not to be seen as just simply releasing the learner from the program and giving us as teachers, for example, as some might view it as a wee bit of downtime. It has actually got to be related, and it's got to be meaningful. And think about the inspection framework, and think about Gatsby and the benchmarks there, how important that is. So I think it's important to get away from that more traditional model. And Jess, you've obviously seen that traditional model in some places, haven't you?
Absolutely, yeah. I think the importance is looking at, we're trying to steer away from that typical 2 week block that students do, that I remember doing when I was in year 10 and year 11, and also whilst I was in sixth form, where it was almost kind of, you know, shoehorning a student into a placement because they had to do that. Whereas with the industry placements, you know, there's even more of a focus on the fact that it is meaningful, it's high quality, and it's structured. And obviously it states there about it could be delivered in different methods. It might not be a single block. For us, we look at 1 day a week for 45 weeks to fulfill the 315 hours of T-level placement, which is much more meaningful, and it's worked around the needs of our employers. So the 2 week one perhaps is from my experience slightly frowned upon, because it's more like a babysitting program, and that's not what we want for our employers. And equally, we don't want our young people to go into a work experience and come back and say, all I did was make cups of coffee and sweep the floors. Actually, we want them to be doing some project work and something that's incredibly meaningful, that gives them the best possible opportunity of potential employment with that company, or employment and progression within the future.
I think that's a good point you've made about how it's got to link to the young person's career aspirations as well as the needs of the employer. And I think that's why the industry placement, whether it be 3, 6 months, a year, whatever, however long it is, and clearly for Kickstart it'll be up to 6 months, has got to really focus on what the needs of that individual learner are, and matching them in terms of progression opportunities to what's the availability of, for example, an apprenticeship or a job. And the point you made also is critical. It's not necessarily completing a single block. This is to some extent got to reflect the needs of the employer, who in some cases might want to split it or whatever, or might want it in a different format, and they might want that person 1 or 2 days a week for the next 24 weeks. It's got to really fit with that pattern of requirement from the employer.
Absolutely. And you need to be a bit creative with that as well, actually. In the current climate, getting our students out onto a placement that is specifically to what they want to do. So let's take, for example, a performing arts student. Getting them on a stage right now is incredibly challenging. So how do we look at other opportunities that provide them with a similar skill set and similar opportunities that will still prepare them for a career in that industry, but it might not be specifically in that area right now due to the nature of the situation we find ourselves in.
And in fact, what we will talk about later on is some of the innovation that we're seeing in industry placements during COVID-19. For example, I've been looking at some examples of what we call virtual work experience, which I think has been, again, showing the innovation that's there during these difficult times. I think the other thing to note, and Pat's already asked that question, is that if the person realizes that even after a few weeks or months, it isn't really for them, is to have the flexibility to find a different work placement for them. That's one thing that we have picked up from all the industry placement pilots, is if that match doesn't work, don't prolong the agony either for the employer or the young person, and then you might have to find an alternative for them. Or it might be that, in fact, that isn't the most suitable route for them, and maybe they would prefer a full-time education route or going into higher education. That's happened to me. It's happened to you as well, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, as well, whether it's the employer or the student actually that come back to us and say, I'm not sure this is going to work. There's other options around that. But I think one of the things that you need to do right at the start of the industry placement is make it very clear what the expectations are from the employer and what the expectations are from the young person. So from my an example I would give of that is one of our students was working in a local mill, and actually that mill is used as a fully working mill, but equally that mill is a tourist destination. People can do tours. So being one of the people that take students on a tour around that site is very different to actually going and making the flour, delivering the flour. So initially you must have it very clearly stated what that opportunity is, what they will cover in that placement, because sometimes that may prevent that situation from happening further down the line, because you have got something to go back to and say, actually, at the start of this, you said that this student might be able to have a look at this area. Is that possible? Or equally, that might be the other way around. And you say to the student, this has been clearly put out for you. You knew what you were entering. What can we do to make that better? So you've always got something to keep going back to.
That's great. Thank you for that. And I think that comes back to obviously what the purpose is. And I think that, for me, is the start point for either increasing the scope or the quality of placements, is to make clear to everyone that's a partner to it what the purpose is. And I think that's why that it's always useful to go back to that original sort of clarification on what the purpose of work experience and industry placements is. And that obviously makes sense to the learner, makes sense to the parents, the guardians, the employer, or any other a third party that might be involved. And clearly that's often the case with awarding bodies, who are very clear about stipulating how important a work experience or work placement is for the achievement of the qualification. So everyone understands it. And that's why I think increasingly those of you who are willing or thinking about coming into the traineeship market for the first time or extending it, is to remember that clear line of sight from the traineeship to an apprenticeship, to the occupational standards, and to the employment that might follow from that. So I think that's a useful thing that you said there, Jess, in making clear that that's what the purpose is for all parties at the very beginning.
Absolutely. Everybody needs to be sold into that vision, and that whatever that project may be, everybody needs to be sold into that at every level, or it's not going to work.
But I mean, one of the questions that Reese is posed here is, what do you do when an employer starts to vary from that, or get distracted, or maybe can't commit, or deviates or strays away from that initial statement?
I think that's where it comes back to your relationship management. So with our college, we've got quite a specific plan of how we maintain and nurture relationships with our employers. So the work placement team specifically focus on the work placements, whereas my team focus on the employer engagement program, which gives us the relationships which allow us to then have those very open conversations and say, right, we've got this statement that you agree to. Perhaps actually the students more capable than we initially thought. They're kind of going at the speed of light, and there's additional things that they could take on, and providing the students happy to then fulfill that, and it still coincides with their area of study, there's no issue there. If and I have it, I've experienced it firsthand where perhaps something hasn't been fulfilled that was in the initial conversation of, actually we'll let them do this, and I've sat down with that company, had a conversation, and come to a solution that has worked for the employer but also for the student, and found those opportunities.
That's good. And I think that's important to stress how the initial engagement is critical with the employer, but the ongoing maintenance of that relationship is critical. And that applies whether you're advertising your traineeships through the National Apprenticeship Service or the National Career Service, is to remember these are brokers, but ultimately the relationship is between you and that individual employer.
Yeah, absolutely. And things, we've just had another comment there as well. Absolutely, things change, and especially in the current climate, we have no idea what's going to happen. And as a business owner myself, I've seen some very, very sudden changes to my business, and that's absolutely fine. I think it's just being able to have an open conversation and come to some form of a solution one way or another, because as I said, at the moment, anything could happen. It's just being able to have the relationship with the employer, to have that conversation and find some form of a solution.
And I think that's the key thing in response to that question. It's about being flexible, isn't it? But that flexibility has got to extend to the learner. And I think that's one of the things that why some of the placements are very successful, because actually the learners have had to demonstrate the flexibility in the raw. They've had to change and they've had to adapt. And that resilience is actually something which holds them in good stead with the employers, doesn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely.
So study programs already built in. We know study programs. We know that it's a critical aspect of a study program is that as part of the non-qualification activity, such as tutorial, we also have a work experience offer. Now that offer will depend on the individual's subjects, the range of employers and different placements that you've got, and also how that fits with the qualifications they're doing. So there'll be different offers for those learners that might be doing A levels, where they might focus on, say, one of the A levels, like a science, and the placement might be appropriate there, as opposed to those learners who might be doing a performing arts program, where that is the primary purpose of the program. So it has to reflect the needs of those individual learners. But even within study programs, we've had problems about the appropriateness and meaningfulness of work experience. Just look at inspection reports over the last 5 or 6 years. Even though all of the evidence shows that the work experience for these young people is critical for progression, for developing an understanding of the world of work, etc. So I think that it's sometimes useful to just go back and say, well, what are the expectations of work experience in terms of not only the scope, but also the quality? So, we know that in terms of looking at study programs for 16 to 19-year-olds, you can see there that it's about a purposeful curriculum that provides progression and stretch, where, for example, you include work experience or industry placements as part of it. So in other words, there's no distinction between the subject I do, it could be science, business studies, art, design, the English and maths and digital skills they do, and wrapping it round your work experience or industry placement. And again, are we showing that this is part of the personal development in terms of punctuality, attendance? The point that one of you raised with the learners changing their minds is how resilient do they become? Are they developing the flexibility and the positive mindset that allows them to take advantage of it? That's all built into expectations. But in more general terms, it's about understanding that we're supposed to be providing all of our learners, young and adult, with knowledge and skills for the future, and that we're developing, particularly with employers, the personal, social, and different skills that make for the more rounded person. But I think, and I know, Jess, you would agree, that surrounding all of this, even though it's not explicit within the new inspection framework, is that all providers should take proper account of the Gatsby benchmarks in terms of best practice in careers education. We don't just mean by the careers team or the tutorial team, we mean by all the different aspects of the curriculum: construction, engineering, hairdressing, whatever. For example, in terms of the experiences of the workplace or engagement with employers. And you think that's quite important, isn't it? That brings the Gatsby to life, doesn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. Again, it comes back to that buy-in from everybody at every level. It has to be a buy-in, and it can't just be something that comes from your careers team. It's got to be something that everybody's sold into, and that's how you obviously have that more kind of fluid approach of the staff going, actually, there's an importance here in experiences of the workplace, and see when staff understand how meaningful that is to the learner experience, then the opportunities you tend to find and the commitment from everyone seems to increase. So definitely Gatsby benchmarks need to be sold in. And I think as well, it's worth just quickly touching on providers' understanding of CSR, so corporate social responsibility. Actually, once we've seen kind of a buy-in from our departments, for example, they understand CSR policies. So a lot of our local employers in their CSR policy as well now have something that will mention work placements or engagement with local schools and colleges. So it's worth checking those out, because actually they might provide you with a gateway into some of your local companies that you're working with.
And in fact, one of our listeners says they help to write a large company's education engagement strategy, which is quite good, because normally we are always involved in writing the employer engagement strategy, but helping an employer to write the education engagement strategy, I think, is quite a nice and novel turn on that. Thank you for that. So, but there is one thing that keeps on coming up, and I know one or two of you asked me to cover this today about what's the role of simulated or internal work experience. I think we've just got to be clear, the expectations from Ofsted point of view, the funders point of view, and the awarding bodies is that, yes, you can use it to build student confidence, develop employability skills. And in fact, as Gordon has just said, almost all of this could be built around employability skills. So using the appropriate facilities that you might have, like the canteen, the office, the hairdressing salon, your reprographics, or a workspace of any sort of workshop, for example, that might be useful. But it's basically there about building confidence and developing those skills. I would suggest, in some cases, before the person goes on an external work experience or placement. For some of your learners, it could also be difficult because it might be a hazardous occupation. They might not have the right age to meet, for example, awarding body requirements, then restrictions, for example, in farming, construction, in some of the complementary therapies. But also, I think the critical thing here is that any internal work experience must be meaningful. It must add value to that young person's experience. It must line up again and have a line of sight with occupational standards. And also because for some learners, the less confident learners, the students with SEND, the young offenders, there might be some elements of the work experience that cannot be done in the workplace for all kinds of reasons that you might have to duplicate or simulate inside the organization. I think also during the COVID-19 lockdowns, we had to go a little bit this way. And I think sometimes, as I said, as long as that's being used as evidence of the person's work preparation and employability skills, I think it's useful. And it's just got to take account of the fact that it might be difficult in the current situation. Jess, you're using internal work experience with the preparation of learners for their supported internships.
Absolutely. We have several outlets within our college community where they are dedicated to the internal work experience. So we have a couple of our canteens that are specifically for those students to gain experience. So we have a member of staff that oversees that, but the rest of the staff are our students in preparation for their supported internships. I think as well, coming back onto what you were just saying about the, being meaningful, I think it depends where you put the student in terms of internal work experience. Because I remember doing my GCSEs, and my friend was very much into art, and she just kind of spent her placement with the art teacher in the classroom. But actually, I think for some of our digital students, perhaps it would make more sense and be more meaningful to put them in our marketing department than it would to just put them in the classroom with their teacher. Or if it's teaching that they're interested in, putting them in another levels sessions, for example, with a different tutor that they're not kind of working with directly. So it definitely comes back to meaningful and brokering those opportunities for students to get those meaningful opportunities.
Yeah, and not to confuse this with a question that one of you has posed, if you're a local authority training provider, the rules are very different. If you are a local authority training provider, you can provide work experience placements for your learners in other departments of the local authority, because they're seen as different entities. So they would be seen as external work placements. For example, if you're the training provider and you put them into the what do you call it, parks and recreation, or into construction, or into, for example, finance or admin, that would be seen as an external work placement. So I just wanted to clarify that whenever you raised that question. Now, you're obviously getting yourself geared up for T-levels, Jess. You know that there is a minimum requirement of 315 hours over the course of the 2 years. We know how it's separately funded from the remainder of the T-level program. We know it's got to be wrapped round the occupational specialism that the learner has chosen. And these are the sort of, if you want, key aspects of it. How are you preparing in your organisation for the workplace, the industry placements in T-levels?
So I think something that we're doing successfully is the staffing of this. So again, the question that we had earlier that was kind of about how do you, come back to the employer with those questions. And I was saying about having an open relationship. So each of our areas has a designated industry placement officer. So they get to know their cohort of students very, very well. They frequently catch up with those students through one-to-ones. And they also do the same with the employers. So it's not a case of, 5 months down the line coming to them and saying, you said you'd do this. Actually, it's ever changing through the conversations that they're having with their key contacts, and that work placement coordinator is in the middle of that contact. So if there are any issues, it's them that are dealing with that directly, which is quite a nice way to organise it. And also we've got people that are specifically focusing on specific sectors, which works really, really nicely. I think, again, it's working with our employers, so through things like employer forums, to get their perspective and see what their potential barriers might be, or what might particularly support them to take on some industry placements, because of course there are challenges. One of the key things that we found is some of our employers locally that maybe don't want to take on an apprentice because they're out and about a lot, and perhaps they can't be there to support and supervise that student 4 days a week. Actually, they're in the office dedicated 1 day a week, so that they can have an industry placement. So it's a really nice way to fill some of those gaps, and it's got to be about the employer and working around the needs of that employer, but also finding the right student. Because if you don't put the right student in the right placement, that's when you're going to have some of those issues of the student not being happy and or the employer not being happy as well. So it's very much balancing the two relationships between the students directly and the employers.
And how far have you had to sort of extend your reach to satisfy the different placements that you're offering?
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could say we've been quite creative with it. Obviously, some of our students come with some quite niche requests, for example, or some very niche areas that they're interested in. And equally, it might be that we get some fantastic opportunities, but it's not something locally. An example of work experience, a lot of our students are particularly interested in forensics, which if you look directly at Barnsley, you're not going to get a job in forensics in Barnsley. So actually then we're needing to go out a little bit more further afield and having those relationships. So through the partnership that I run, we are now making both national and international relationships, because we also have an opportunity for students to go and perhaps do so much as a month working in another country on something, and then using their second industry placement back in the UK, perhaps more locally. So it's about being adaptable, I think, and creating the best opportunities for the students, and then tackling those potential barriers such as travel and costs and things afterwards.
And do you think the proposed, well, the actual rate of £550 spread over 2 years, do you think that's enough to cover the cost of planning, arranging and delivering these placements, particularly when we start mentioning high travel costs?
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenging amount. What I would say is it totally depends on the student that you're working with. You might have one student who gets a placement that is a 5-minute walk from their house. They don't need any travel costs, and perhaps at the most they might need lunch providing, for example. That's a much smaller number to a student that perhaps might get an opportunity in a digital agency, and we can only get that student the opportunity if they have a laptop, this specific laptop, at £3,500. Well, actually, suddenly that's much more money that we need to be spending on that student than the one who's found a very local opportunity. So it's more of a case-by-case basis. And so I suppose my answer is £550 is a challenging amount, specifically if you're trying to get the best opportunities.
Yeah, and what about the other thing, I suppose, given COVID conditions, and obviously different providers will have decided that what point they're going to enter the T-level market. Some are already doing it, some are planning to do it next year, depending on which areas are coming up, which subject areas are coming up. But what do you find, what are you going to do if they say, well, I want to be able to get a placement as a midwife, but they can't do that because of COVID? You know, how are we encouraging them maybe to do something slightly different, but still in this sort of in the area of, for example, health and social care, maybe
Absolutely.
working with the mother and baby group, or
Absolutely.
working with local GPs?
Yeah, we do a lot of that. I think, as somebody's just mentioned, about managing some of those expectations, and also looking at things like soft skills, and those, the skills that will transfer between different roles. So we have a lot of our childcare and health and social care students in particular that we might not be able to get them in their ideal placement. So then it's about, again, maintaining and keeping up with those conversations with the student and looking at the alternatives that give that similar skill set. So perhaps we work very closely with our local library. Now, actually, our local library has a midwife that's in several times a week. We have mother and baby groups in there. There's actually a lot of different services in there that cover the sort of health and social care subject. So, for example, a lot of our students may go and work there. So it's getting them to understand the industry, sharing things like labour market information, and also we balance that up, I think, with our employer talks. So we have a lot of guest speakers and workshops throughout the year that will, reiterate the fact that the skills that they're getting from that placement will still allow them to potentially, progress onto the correct university course or progress on to becoming a GP in the future.
That's great, and I think that there's a bit of advice there, by the way, on your £3,000 or £4,000 laptop.
Absolutely.
Is that we can actually spread the cost over the useful life of the laptop.
Course.
Not as one person thought, the useful life of the student. I think that's not quite what we mean.
Yeah.
But I think that's useful point you've raised there.
Definitely.
And of course, to help us get ready for this, we've had the Capacity and Development Fund, and I think that's important to suggest to people that that's why the T-level and the T-level investment spread across several years to get you into that have the capabilities, what Jess talked about in terms of staffing, in terms of infrastructure, that these are very important, but they're not just applied to T-levels, they will be applied to all of your learners on vocational and technical study programs, and not just T-levels. So you've got that once you've got that infrastructure, it can be applied to different funding routes, and that's what you've done, haven't you?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
But I think that has told us, I think T-levels in themselves have told us that there's quite a lot of key challenges here, just in terms of scope. And I think one of the things that that's being referred to here is that, we've not only got this T-level as a sort of has this wonderful national ambition to develop highly skilled people at level 3, 4, 5 and beyond through, in particularly into those areas where the biggest demand for skills is going to be. But I think that's also, and one person's already suggested, as you said, if there are very few jobs in forensic science in Barnsley, or there's very few jobs with Apple or Google in a small rural town, how do we manage those expectations?
Yeah, I mean, I personally, from my experience, so I know what you're saying with the Apple and Google. I've got one student that comes to my mind that I've been working with quite closely, who absolutely wants to work on iOS for Apple, absolutely more than anything on, on this planet. But this student, actually, if you think about it, that student wants that because that student is aware of Apple and is aware of Google and wasn't aware of our local IT companies and software developers and things like that. So again, I think through your guest speakers and having effective guest speakers and doing it in a way where students get the opportunity to ask the questions they need to ask and find out all the fantastic things about your local community of employers, that works really well. We do industry weeks for every one of our departments every year. So our students are getting new and up-to-date information from a lot of different local and regional and sometimes national companies from their sector. So I think, whilst yes, at the back of this student's mind, he still wants to work on iOS, and he has actually now got an opportunity to work on iOS, but that's because of the work experience he's had with one of our smaller local companies, who has now actually taught him the skills he will need to go on and work for iOS, and also giving him some expectations and some new thoughts, because actually this student now wants to have his own company as well in the local area. So I think it's about inspiring the students and being realistic. When we talk about forensics, I don't want to say to a student, you're not going to become a forensic scientist, for example. But what I want to do is make them aware of the labour market, aware of the opportunities or lack of opportunities locally, and aware of the competition, and allow them to make an informed decision based on statistical, factual information.
Now that will come back to how important that awareness of the labour market, local level, sub-regional, regional and national is in terms of placements as part of your, if you want, the underpinning philosophy. Because I do think that without the understanding of where the job opportunities are, where the employment opportunities are, you actually are looking at basically placing people in situations which might be useful in the short run and might give them some, but it will never directly deliver some of those career aspirations. It might actually change the career aspirations, because actually, as you said, if you place someone in a forensic science lab, they might actually think, well, actually, I thought this was going to be something like, what's on television. What I've done is I've analyzed all of these bits of evidence, for 40 hours this week. When do I get out to see the body, as they say? Well, that's not the forensic industry. No. So, but I think that what we've found, that study programs and T levels have shown up, first of all, the challenges in terms of scope, made worse, of course, by what's happening currently in terms of the COVID-19. But what it highlighted was the importance of preparing the students, points that we've all raised about their knowledge, skills and behaviors needed, as well as their aspirations, their dreams, and balancing what they're doing with obviously other activity, because that's constantly the issue. You've got to make sure that balance is still there between the work placement and the rest of the program. You've highlighted how important it is to engage with employers who might not see placements as a business priority, especially at the moment. It might be survival. Finding the right placements we've talked about, and we'll talk a wee bit about the different agencies and how your team has gone about getting the right placements. And of course, they don't want to be contacted because everyone, the school, the college, the university, the training provider might be contacting the same employer. Absolutely. But also, I think there's a big step up, and you're right to highlight that step up from work experience, the sort of 1 week, 2 week model, to what's in the industry placements for T levels. And that is a change in mindset for the whole of your institution. You've highlighted for every curriculum area, not just the sort of work placement team or the enterprise team. But I think what's really important is this planning side, fitting the work preparation into the available hours, which we've obviously raised some interesting issues with T levels. And I think there's got to be a better link between the core study and the work placement. If the core study is science and the work placement doesn't relate directly to the objectives in that science program, why are we doing it? And then we've highlighted already, one of you has already highlighted how difficult it is to get these special, high quality work placements, especially in rural areas. And it does therefore bear very much about looking at supply chains, about transport links, about doing some of it remotely, about, I mean, we were talking about placements in the renewables. Well, the renewables could mean that your placement involves you living away from home for 2 weeks, you know, on a platform in the North Sea, or, you know, in the northeast of Scotland. So I think we've got to have a much, you know, this is a real test of the way that we plan, we present, and critically, as you said, how well we communicate the work placement model and the industry placement model, particularly in T levels, to all staff, students, parents, and employers. And you've highlighted that. One thing, though, I wanted to just add is that there's also the quality issue, because I can get, I mean, we're bidding obviously for 250 traineeships. We will have 200 to 250 placements. We've already got them. We've already lined up the employers. But are they the right quality? Is it the right, you know, and it's not just about matching numbers, because very often you see that as success, don't you, Jess?
Yeah.
I've got 80 T-level students to find placements. I've got 80 placements. Wow, sorted. Isn't like that.
No.
I think there's inconsistency that's been found by Ofsted. There's insufficient pre-placement preparation. So quite a lot of the learners will go into placements and not be adequately prepared for the placement. That's what they found. Poor matching of employer and student needs, because those perceptions were not checked. A point that a couple of questions have already raised. And then I think there's also about, well, how do we keep a record of the activity? You know, what do we know what learning's gone on? And that if you don't have the active engagement of the employer, the workplace supervisor, or the owner, how are you going to do that? So I think there's also that issue about, well, where are the resources to support the students? You know, I know that, for example, Pearson, when we were at Pearson, we produced some guides on how to find your own work experience. Well, they were quite useful, because to some extent, they posed the question with the individual learner. Have you asked yourself these things before you start saying, this is the type of placement I want? So it's part of that exercise. Now, you've found this, haven't you, in terms of, you know, we can get the right number of placements, but are they the right ones?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, what you find as well is sometimes you have some companies that are so grateful for their placements and the extra pair of hands. I'd say probably more so with charities, obviously, and understandably, that they'll take lots and lots and lots of placements, but it then doesn't make sense for us to just go, oh, there's a placement opportunity there. You know, let's shove all the students in that. That's not the best idea. So I think, you know, definitely making sure that the student is a match. What you were just saying about the resources as well, we have a handful of different resources. So we have a student brochure, which has like a bit of a personality quiz and some career questions in there, as well as an employer brochure as well that they can have a little bit of a look on. So once, before they even sign up to anything, they have clear kind of insight into what some of the expectations are, what might happen, what we're looking for, and then that's followed up with the platform that we use. So I know somebody's just put something about reflection. So the program that we collect all the data, our students go on each week, they'll reflect on their learning, they'll input the hours that they've been a part of. That all the employer will also have access to that platform. The work placement officer will also have a link onto that platform. But then also now from this month, that also links in with their careers advice and guidance. So any of the guest speakers that they've had with myself, any of the workshops, workplace tours, any of the one-to-one careers advice that they've had, you know, all of that becomes one big kind of ball of information around that student. So we have a really, really good insight into which of those students we're working with. At Reese, we're currently working with Grow Far.
That's a good intervention, because I was going to ask you as well. And I think that whether you're using OneFile, Grow Far, Pro Monitor, I think, you know, it's got to be appropriate for its purpose. But I think the nature of the question there was, you know, how do we ensure that whatever system we're using, those learners actually do it? So there's a sense of discipline that's required. And I know that this is difficult with COVID at the moment in terms of social distancing.
Yeah.
But I think that's one of the aspects of that development, is that to some extent your young people are also acting as ambassadors for your organization.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And sometimes, sorry.
Correct. Carry on, no, carry on.
And sometimes they will actually help the employer realize that they've got to do certain things. And I mean, sometimes I know it can be seen as a bit of a pain, but I did find that when we're doing the health and safety checks and some of the placements, taking the young person with us, they are sometimes spotted things that neither us nor the employer had actually taken account of.
Yeah.
So, you know, that's a useful aspect of their training.
Mm-hmm. Can I just touch on one of the questions that has just come up, please?
Yes,
about the barriers with social distancing, and how do we get the employers to take on students whilst not taking away too much time from the employer who's short-staffed or working from home? There's a couple of ways I would say that. Obviously, for us, some of the ways we've tackled that is by the remote learning, which, in my opinion, doesn't obviously give quite the same experience, purely because they're missing out on the social element of that. Unless some of our companies are very, very active online and social, and, you know, they'll have regular meetings and regular like work together sessions where, even though they might not even talk, it's at least got a bit of a feeling like they're sat in an office together. I think one of the ways I looked at it, and this was as an employer that I looked at this over lockdown, was that rather than seeing it as a potential barrier, I saw it as a strength. And the reason that I say that is because a lot of our the companies that we were working with suddenly had some of them had staff that obviously left for whatever reason. Some of them have had staff that have panicked and moved on to other careers, and actually some of them, you know, are still fully staffed but feel that they need an extra pair of hands. And actually this for them, with the industry placements, has become a really helpful, almost like a bit of, you know, gold dust for them, because they're able to access someone that they can mold around the values of their company, who will consistently be with them once a week. They know when they're coming in, they can plan for the activity for that student, they can still make it meaningful, but also there's a clear benefit to their company. So I think that's worked to our strength. And actually it is, I think, because we're going with that attitude, a lot of the employers that we're working with are finding it, you know, a bit of a godsend, to be honest, and are going, actually, I see the benefit in having somebody come once a week, and we then obviously manage the expectations around COVID and that side of things. So I think absolutely there's issues with social distancing, but equally there are some strengths that come with that as well.
So I think that's spot on, because what you've identified is some of the barriers, given, never mind COVID, never mind the current situation, even before that, employers had identified barriers to offering more placements, or in some cases barriers to offering any placements. But as you said, you know, negative experiences of the past, well, we are a different provider. We will show you a very different model. Join us, have the confidence building, that relationship with them. I think we should take some of the weight of them, and certainly in terms of administration, we found that really particularly, we in effect operate the administrative system for the placements, not the employer. And the employer, it's linked to the colleges or to our institution's CRM. So we have this as part and parcel of the normal relationship development. I know you have as well. But I mean, there are some quite important things there that we've got to recognize are real concerns, and we've got to have answers. And I think that's why, to some extent, this is, you know, what we can learn from the industry placement pilots over those years is, you know, that there's an important set of issues for students, parents, and the guardians, identifying, you know, the right placement, raising awareness, relevance to their career, you know, fitting in their own part-time jobs, which I know many of us have done as part of preparation for T levels, but also that, you know, this has got to be balancing other sort of commitments that those learners have. And that's about developing that broader resilience, which I think is critical. But from the point of view of curriculum, I think it's important also that we get that buy-in. And I know that, Jess, you and your team work extensively across your organization to make sure that it isn't just the sort of employability enterprise team, it's right across the whole of the curriculum.
Absolutely. Yeah. Everything that we do is, you know, reflected in every department. We work closely with every department for all ages, actually, for work experience for our, you know, 14 to 16-year-olds all the way up to our adult learners or HE learners. So I think it's definitely got to be something that's embedded within the curriculum. So we developed a range of tutorial sessions that repeatedly look at your employability skills, but in a slightly different way. And they've actually been really, really impactful. And the students involved in that, the feedback has been excellent, and we are seeing more and more students going and coming back to us as a team and saying, actually, I got my placement, or I've had a job interview and I actually got the job because I listened to what you said in this session. So I think I suppose what we do in terms of those tutorials is almost repeat the same information but through different methods, and that does work. Again, in terms of our employer engagement program, the branding for that, for example, wherever you go within our college, you will see, this might sound really silly, but the pens, the water bottles across the college at every level, so, which, demonstrates that everybody's bought into it. Everybody knows what we mean when we talk about that program. And that's the same with employers. We go into our employers' offices and they'll have their certificate of partnership on the wall. They'll have their water bottle on the desk. And it's about that buy-in and embedding that throughout the partnerships that we have, but also throughout the curriculum.
I think that's a useful point you've said about getting that feel right across the whole of the institution. And of course, I think, with the emphasis on employability skills that one of you has taught, I can see that why the whole of your curriculum has got to be very much focused on the needs of the labour market, but not exclusively, because don't forget, some of our learners delay the decisions, maybe going into higher education, but they've still got that line of sight with a career aspiration. I know in some cases they'll be very broad, in some cases much more focused, but it's about that, having that constant regard that the curriculum has got to be meaningful, it's got to be relevant, and it's got to be of high quality. And that extends to obviously how we engage with our employers. And you've been talking about any strategy, a whole range of strategies that overcome some of those resistances that we talked about, streamlining the paperwork, avoiding extensive numbers of visits to the employer. Is when I think you get that visit, what do you call it? Fatigue, don't you?
Yes, definitely.
Now, not all employers will have access to the new technologies. I mean, we've been using obviously Zoom and Teams. Now, some of them have had enough of that. So I think it's about not overdoing some of the reliance on the technology. And sometimes you need to have the personal discussion with them. But I think that's very much more difficult at the moment. And we've got to understand that everyone's got to be a bit more patient. One thing I was very clear is that there's a confusion sometimes between developing an ongoing sustainable relationship with the employer so you can get more high quality placements, and the hard sell. And I think that's why we've got to make sure that when we are making the pitch is of mutual benefit to the learner and the employer. And then we have that really concentrated effort around matching, which I think that's why I think the idea of Talent United or talent pipelines or talent finders are all very important aspects of how you can successfully increase the scope and quality of placements. And I know you have a big emphasis on talent, the talent pipeline.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, so Talent United is the employer engagement program that I run, but it's very much a two-way partnership. So all of these partners that we have are actively involved in the college, be it placements, apprenticeships, talks, workshops, workplace visits, career safaris, all that sort of stuff. But then equally, we give them something back. And I know one of the challenges was on that was previously on the slide was about time and companies not having enough time to do things. Well, obviously we can't give people more time, but what we can do is give them additional things. So we have a free CPD program for all of our partners, and every member of their staff can get involved in that for free. We have free and discounted courses. We have opportunities for them to upskill their current staff in. So if they've got a member of staff that displays leadership qualities, we can put them on a course for free to actually develop those leadership qualities. So it's about giving something back. And I think it's very much about it being a two-way program. As an employer and as someone that also works in education, there's clear benefits from that two-way program, and being a bit creative with that as well. Sometimes it's the little things like sending them a Christmas card, every year, just as a reminder that actually you are appreciative of their time. And I will see so many people respond to that or share that on LinkedIn, for example, because actually they value those interactions.
I think that highlights also that important thing about understanding, that those interactions are critical, but you've also got to spend a bit of time just listening to the employer and knowing what's your business
Absolutely.
cycle, when you're going to recruit. I mean, especially for traineeships, don't think of traineeships as an academic year. It has to fit with the employer's recruitment pattern. So for example,
Absolutely.
if you're talking about the horticultural industry, things like Wyvale, Dobies, etc., they recruit for February and March starts to match with Easter, given it
might be more difficult in the future. But so your traineeship program would have to run for, say, 6 months before that, not to fit with, you know, your academic year. Some employers want to find their own placements. Now, it's great when you get the employer coming and saying, I've got the following placements already charted. Now you match that. That's great. We get that a lot with, for example, the banking industry. They'll say, we want 3 placements in there, 2 placements in there, 2 of them will be FE, 3 of them will be HE. You know, they're very clear about their needs, and I think you've got to be able to fit what their desire there. So I think these are all what we've learned from the pilot. But applying all of that now, not just for T levels, because the point I think is critical is we're looking here at placements across a whole range of provisions, study programs, T levels, but also in traineeships. Now we know what the traineeship investment's going to be about. It's about basically creating an offer that allows people over the course of 3 months, 6 months, up to 12 months to orientate themselves towards a job with preferably with an apprenticeship. And that program includes work preparation training, a substantial work placement element, and then anything else that you need to build around that individual learner, particularly if it's English, maths, digital skills, or ESOL, as well as maybe a vocational qualification. For example, for Amazon, it might be forklift truck driving. For the renewables industry, it could be safe working at heights. So that we've got these programs and that the flexibilities that have been introduced from the 1st of September of this year that allow them to be shorter, not a minimum of 100 hours, now a minimum of 70 hours, with more than one employer. The increased cost for adults of the core learning aim, which is the work prep and the work placement, as well as the incentive payments to employers, which allow them to cover the cost of administering their involvement in the traineeship and the purchase of things like additional PPE for trainees. So we've got a very different type of offer, but nevertheless, it's still got this line of sight to an occupational standard in an apprenticeship. And by the way, inside traineeships, this is just a little, just to highlight a couple of points, because I think it's got to be clear what the purpose is. It's got to involve an external employer. Ultimately, Ofsted are going to make judgments about the suitability of your work placements and trainees. It does allow some simulated activity, but it doesn't count towards the work placement, i.e. the 70 hours. It can be with more than one employer, but it's got to be at least 2 weeks with each employer and at least 70 hours. And don't forget, for those learners that are coming to you on job seekers allowance or universal credit, it's got to be no more than 240 hours of placement. So when you start to look at traineeships, I think you've got to be clear that the requirements when we're looking at next, well, I think it closes next Wednesday, the procurement, is such that you've got to understand that there's a different way of funding young people on a traineeship. They're funded for the total number of hours. But the one condition on young people is that a work placement must be the most substantial element of the program. It's also the core aim. That's what we determine whether they're being retained on or not. So a work placement in this little example, 200 hours, 2.5 hours a week for 10 weeks, that would earn you that part-time rate. For an adult, it's each separate element. And for any of the new starts from the 1st of September, it's at 1,500. That's significantly higher than it was before for the work preparation and the work placement, which could be at least 70 hours. And then each separate component for that individual learner, whether it be English, maths, essential digital skills, or a flexible offer, will be separately funded. The maximum funding for in any of the bands, because there are 3 bands that you'll notice, is 4,400, which is the maximum for any adult to be funded through the AEB. Remember, this is through the adult education budget. And I know that some of you will certainly have asked me questions about that. Now, the key thing here to note is that whether it be a T level, a study program, the Kickstart scheme, whatever, or a traineeship, there is an important aspect that we've mentioned several times, haven't we, Jess?
Yeah,
matching.
Definitely.
And I think that the secret of all of this is how we match the needs of the individual employer and help to articulate those if they're not clear. And that's why sometimes, you know, when you operate with, for example, MENCAP, who will do community placement placements for learners with special education needs and or disabilities, you often get a much clearer requirement of what the employer is looking for, which is then easier to match with the requirements of the student or the parent guardian if they're a younger person, or if they're a person who has got a guardian. And then you, the provider, have got to balance all of those, and then you design the program. Now that is critical for traineeships, because I know that the query that sometimes you say is, well, we're not sure until the trainee turns up through induction what we actually will design the program, how it will look. Well, it might look that you only need to give them the work placement, so you'll get £1,500. Why? Because they've got the English, they've got the maths, they've got the digital skills, and they've got the flexible learning. Another will need all. They'll need English, maths, functional skills to get them right to the right level, digital skills, and maybe some kind of flexible offer there. So you cannot determine what the program is until you've matched all these things. And I strongly suggest to you, you must have this frame of mind when you're constructing a traineeship. Jess, you obviously will see how that is a very individual program, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. I'd like to add as well that the buy-in from the parent and guardian is honestly crucial. So for us, we'll have students that are happy on their placement, but they'll wake up and they'll think, oh gosh, it's 7 o'clock and I've got to go to wherever to go and do my placement. And actually it's been their parents going, oh, you're on placement this morning, aren't you? Get up, get out of bed. And actually the parents are bought into that idea. So for us, we have a lot of parent evenings, and it's not just come and sit and have a listen. They're really engaging, and it makes them feel part of the college community, and also shows them some of our college sites and resources. So for example, we've done like a pie and peas night, and even like a pub quiz night, where one of the rounds has been dedicated to questions around placements or employability or HE progression, and actually they've gone down really, really well. Once you've got the buy-in from the parent and guardian, they're the people at home that are doing the work placement coordinator's job of reminding them and encouraging them to get up and go to those placements. So buy-in from parents and guardians is crucial.
Absolutely, thanks for that, and that's so true, and it's always important to bear that in mind. So to sum up, from all those different contexts, and Jess has brought this to life because she's doing this every day of the week, is how important it is to get from you, the provider, the right approach to your placements, whether it be work experience, the shorter or the longer model. Is that, what we've got to do is understand that we have to have the right structures in place. And I think it's critical to have your champions within the governors. Have you got a governor, for example, has got a link role to oversee the general mission and purpose of the organization in terms of employer engagement and placements? At the senior management level, have you got the central placement teams to ensure consistency? You've got to have the appropriate management structure, and then invest in all of those different people and the processes. For example, getting that system in that will record all activity that makes it easier for the employer. But I don't think we can underestimate how much time it takes. And I think that's the criticality. This has got to be carefully planned and planned for success. But also, when you've identified what the barriers are, for example, for young people participating and valuing it properly, including, for example, their commitment to it, as well as from the employers, you've got to have got strategies for them. I like the idea of skills boards. You talked about curriculum areas having their own sort of employer boards. We like them because that gives us that direct input into curriculum development, but also means we have the links with those employers as they go through the different stages in the business cycle. Sometimes they say, don't come anywhere near us. We've just laid off 50 staff. Others might say, we are in the process of recruiting, but we would like to test, try before we buy. Others will say, well, we've got the spare head, we've got projects that need doing. Can you provide us with the intelligence, which, is basically our students, to be able to turn those projects around? I think for me, the most important thing is to line this up, because if you put in your traineeships or any of these things, and let's assume the same with T-levels, they have to be lined up to jobs which are going to be there at the end of the period of training. So at the moment, labour market intelligence tells us which sectors they're not going to have those opportunities in. We don't know what's going to happen with hospitality and things like that, travel and tourism. But we do know that there are significant skill shortages in health and social care, logistics. We're working a lot with Amazon and IKEA. And obviously in digital, right across the piece. If anything, that's taught us how important that is. And obviously into a range of different occupations with renewables. And when you're thinking of renewable energy, you're talking about mechanical, you're talking about electrical, you're talking about electronic, you're talking about IT, you're talking about digital, you're talking about servicing, you're talking about operations, you're talking about maintenance. It's a very broad range of occupations. But also to make sure that we engage effectively with our key partners. You've mentioned some of them, Jess. What about
Absolutely.
your LEP? What about your Chamber of Commerce?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, again, gold dust. And for us, it's not even particularly just our local Chamber of Commerce, it's other ones within the region. We don't just have a good relationship with our local Chamber of Commerce, but the other two big ones within our area. Because, you know, as we're all aware, you can't just get placements from your local area. And the buy-in again and the support needs to come from not just one area, but several across the region and nationally. So I think you definitely need to be getting buy-in, and buy-ins from your local, you know, your business centres, for example. So we have a local business innovation centre which has well over 250 businesses in. Well, we have the key contact of the director of the place itself, and actually they've got buy-in to placements and to the employer engagement, and then that's dispersed across all of those companies. Again, things like that are really particularly helpful, because that's again a way to introduce you to new contacts, find those new placement opportunities, because they're also in that building with those companies day in, day out. And if they've heard someone say, oh, actually we're thinking we'd like somebody, but we, you know, perhaps we haven't got the budget for someone at the moment, well, there's your little gem of information to then follow up on that.
And obviously the CDF helps you to build your capacity. But I think you're right. You've got to, I mean, we can't, you know, as one of our listeners has said, we don't line up people to fail, because obviously if the placement's not there or it's not successful, that's going to jeopardize the future of the student.
Absolutely.
I think that's why I would say that as extensive a range of sources of placement as possible. I mean, you know, we can use placement finders, broker organizations. I mean, particularly, you know, we use MenCap. We also use, you know, each local authority has got community placement brokers for learners with SEN. Use them. Use the Careers and Enterprise Company. Use the National Apprenticeship Service. The National Apprenticeship Service, employers can advertise placements, you know, particularly for traineeships. Because we work a lot with the finance sector, we use a company called The Brokerage, which finds placements for people who want careers in the city. And that includes mentoring. So you've got to get all of these things right, the logistics right, the timetabling right, the commitment of the learners we've talked about, selling the benefits to everyone, the chance to be talent spotted. You know, how often we say that to learners and they don't believe us, but then what happens when, you know, halfway through their traineeship, they come to us and say, I need to leave. Why? Because I'm being offered a full-time job at Debenhams and, you know, so I can't carry on. Well, that's exactly what we did. That's why we placed you with Debenhams. But making sure that all of that experience is then relating back to the core learning, whether it be on a T level, on a traineeship, a study program, whatever. So I think we've got a whole lot of different aspects of working with the employers to make sure it's not just a hard sell. You particularly say this is about building a sustainable relationship.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's got to be a long-term relationship. When you're going into any conversation with any employer about absolutely anything, it doesn't matter whether you speak to them about a placement, about an apprenticeship, about delivering a talk, whatever that might be, you want to be creating a relationship with that company that allows you to then have the same talks, the same placements, the same apprenticeships next year, in 5 years, in 10 years. And actually what we find is that once you nurture those relationships and they're consistent, and then they'll agree to do something else. So then they might go, oh, we took a work placement student, would really like to come and deliver some talks. Oh, actually, we've just given that work placement student an apprentice, so we'd like to take another one to fill that gap of the day that they're out. So those long-term relationships are really, really important. And actually, they then do some of that marketing for you, because they obviously, the businesses are in their own community. They will go out and tell their contacts, oh, actually, we've had this student and this is the relationship we've got with Barnsley College and we're part of Talent United. At the minute, I don't post anything around Talent United really on LinkedIn, because our partners go and do that for us. And that's a really, really healthy position to be in.
And they're very often much more social media savvy than we are, aren't they?
Absolutely.
Because that's their business success. But I think all of those, we've put all those little factors that we've related to, such as sometimes remember it's about reputation, about corporate social responsibility, but also it's just in some cases just makes business sense to have that spare pair of hands. Or we have a specific project. Give us a team of young people that can solve that project for us, and then see the benefits there. But also different employers have different requirements. The point Jess has made, there's no one size will fit all for any of your placements model. So you've got to offer a wide range of options, depending on what the needs of the employer are. But also, as you said, sometimes we take, when an apprentice comes in to do the block release or day release, we replace them with the employer with a suitable alternative, whether it be a person in the second year of their study program, because then that gets the ongoing relationship. But I think, for me, use any agency you can to assist with placements. The secret is we've never stopped using a range of, for the National Service, the National Career Service, we use a whole range of places to try and build that employer commitment and that employer list too.
Absolutely.
But I think it's the employer's got to see that the time they put in benefits them. And I think that's why I like this idea that you particularly have Talent United, is this idea that we are all in it. It's not just the provider, it's also the employers and the different agencies, and we're providing that skilled pipeline. So plan as best you can, take advantage of all the different things we talked about, make sure that we understand what the conditions are in each sector. If you've got teams already out engaging with employers, plug into them. That's what you do, Jess. You've got that constant sort of source of information coming in from your different sources. Yeah. Look at some of the research, by the way, about how important work placements are and what they add to the employer, but also to the young person. And then use all the other agencies that you can, such as the AOC, ETF, the British Association for Supported Employment's got some really good stuff there, as well as MenCap. And I know that, from your point of view, Jess, that you can't replace the sort of knowledge that your staff have built up in terms of the needs of the employers and the young people.
No, absolutely.
So some innovative approaches that we've talked about. I know that we've often involved the learners in designing their own work placements, in designing the contracts, for example, what they expect to get from it. They advise new students. We had the students produce the top 10 tips. Every group produces a new top 10, by the way, and good lunch comes up as second or third on a lot of those lists. But also, if you've got a really good work experience, get the positives out in your case studies. I know you do this, because that dispels some of those negative attitudes, particularly from parents who often say it's cheap labor.
Yeah. I think that's one of the big challenges you face when parents or students think, hang on a minute, this is taking the Michael a little bit, but actually you need to demonstrate that it's a value added process. And equally, what you do need to make sure, because I have seen this as well, is that the employer isn't using it as free labor, because we have, I've experienced companies before who have agreed to take on a placement, and then I'll say, oh no, actually we're going to need them for 3 days a week, and they need to work between 9 and 5. Well, actually that's a totally different offer. That's a totally different ball game, and that's not what we're trying to achieve. So, just whilst, yes, you want to maintain the relationship with that company, equally, you've got to be fair to the students that you're working with, because it needs to be value added, and it needs to not come across as, we're just taking the mick and trying to give companies.
And be a bit innovative in the way that you introduce learners to employers and vice versa. You use speed dating interviews, don't you?
Absolutely. So in the 2 years ago, we started to fill all the gaps in terms of what we were aware that students were struggling with, and career gaps, because I think generally speaking, a lot of young people will be quite black and white with careers. So I'll always remember the first day I went into college and I had a business student and I said, oh, what do you want to do, once you finish this course? Well, I could go to uni and do business, or I could work in a business. Well, that is very, very vague. So we filled those gaps and showed them other areas of their sector. But then last year, we realised as well that the students, when they were having opportunities to ask questions, weren't engaging with that because they don't want to put their hand up. So instead, what we did, we started speed networking sessions where we'd have around 35 different companies represented from different areas of that sector. And students went around and spent 3 minutes with every person. I did a bit of an introduction where they all had an opportunity to think about some questions, write a few down in case they panicked or got nervous, for example. And then they had no choice but to ask those questions. And the amount of students, the last one we delivered, we had 95% of students that were unsure of what they wanted to do in their career. And out of that 95%, which I think was about, there was 40 students involved. So I think out of those 40 students, there was something like, I think it was around 32 students. Well, I'm not really sure what I want to do, but a bit of a rough idea. And we came out with 24 of those going, actually, I've realised what I want to do now. And that's fantastic because actually they're getting meaningful interactions. The Dragon's Den sessions as well, specifically for any student that's slightly enterprising or thinking about, becoming an entrepreneur, that sort of stuff. Being in front of an employer and getting feedback from that person is really, really important. So yeah, those sorts of things allow the students to be in front of the employer and the employer to see the talent pool.
And I think that they're very useful examples. Thanks for that. I mean, I think that the more we think about it, the more obvious sometimes it is that actually that's what young people live in this
Absolutely.
world at the moment. It's interesting, by the way, one of you asked me about virtual work experience. I have seen some examples. Unfortunately, they're almost all from the finance industry and accountancy, where the learners can actually work from home. They're on a placement, they're working from home, but they're on individually agreed projects with all the support systems, the one-to-one with the supervisor and the one-to-one with the training provider. And that's happening down in London at the moment. So we've seen that. But actually, when you think about it, they could be working anywhere. That employer could be an international employer. So there's some great things there, but we've got to see about how that develops. With employers, we've talked a fair bit about some of those things, presentations, using the tasters for a work experience before you do a longer placement. But I think assisting employers with work experience open days, for example, Kickstart. If you've got an employer that's thinking of offering a fair number of placements under Kickstart, they've got to be at least 30, then help them organize the actual open day and how they would do that. So they help to sell the 6-month placements with them. Get involved like that, as well as obviously with a workforce development strategy for an employer that's looking for talent. And I think that quid pro quo where business staff come into the college and college staff go out to the business, you've been doing a fair bit as well, haven't you, Jess?
Absolutely, yeah. I think it's you've got to be constantly listening to the people that you're working with and finding the point, because actually for employers and for the student, they want to know the point in the work experience that they're accessing. An excellent suggestion and kind of something we've done with that is our local library. Now they wanted young people from our college to create, we're very lucky to have a brand new fully digitalized library. They wanted young people to develop digital content for the different areas of that library. And actually, when we have students sat on a course, yes, they're delivering and creating content, but then what happens when they finish that module? Well, it's nothing. Well, actually, now they've got a point, so now they're doing something for a purpose, and that's really helpful. And also listen to the other opportunities with your employers, because actually they might be saying something and you can choose to support that and nurture that relationship, or go, actually, we can't do that. And we've had some really, really bizarre opportunities come from our employers. We've had one of our employers is a chocolatier, and he wanted a purple jacket with red lining making, and one of our students actually went away and made that. We've had students that have created a website or games and different content for companies that are nothing to do with digital. So actually there's so much more opportunity in that initial conversation than just a placement.
Brilliant examples there. And that's our conclusion, really, that engagement is the key to the scope and the quality of your industry and work placements and work experience placements being improved. It's a two-way engagement strategy. The learner, the employer, and use third parties where you need to, you know, whether it be the chambers, whether it be the local authority. But I think the most important thing is look and think differently, have a different mindset, especially if you're faced by some of the issues that you've already raised, which I think are real issues, and hopefully it's getting you to think in a different way. For example, we found in one of our experiences in Barking and Dagenham that actually the best way of getting the placements was to actually share the premises with the employers. So the employers actually came in and used some of the spare space in the institution, and that made a lot of our work placements a lot easier to deliver, because it was actually a separate institution using a distant part of the organisation. And as the head of skills and employability at Califco said, it's an essential part of our business plan for growth, succession, our commitment to developing apprenticeships and jobs for the future. Jess, it's been really good working with you. Thanks very much for all your contributions today. You've brought a lot of light to this. We had loads of questions. That's why we originally planned this for 75 minutes. We've actually gone to 82. But I'm very pleased that the majority of you have stayed on. So very much thanks for listening. If you want to contact us, these are our contact details. Jess, you're happy for people to email you directly?
I am indeed. Yeah, if you've got any questions, Reese, I know you've had a question, and I'm more than happy to answer that if you want to pop it me on an email.
That's brilliant. That's great. And again, thanks everyone. Thanks, Gordon. Thanks for everyone that's participated, and very much thanks to Jess for your contributions today.